I will give you an overview what will happen the next months on Waiheke and what has changed, why it has changed. So as a reminder to what the original plan actually was, what is the rat pilot? Before we can remove the rats from the whole island, Waiheke, we need to know what works on Waiheke. Every island is different. Every island has specifics. And so we have to focus on Waiheke specific questions to find the right tools, techniques that are successful on this island. This involves two parts. It's a technical and a social research. We are a community project, and that's why the community has to be part of it, and that's what the social research covers. My part is more the technical stuff, and I will go through that today a little bit. Yeah. So what has stayed the same when we think about the original rat pilot plan? It was planned to answer the questions to enable an island-wide rat eradication. And we still have the same goal. That has not changed. It's the crucial thing for eradication is to answer all these technical questions. So this has not changed. But the original plan, as most of you know, it was a big area of 800 hectare, more than 800 hectare, where we wanted to remove rats completely and answer all these questions in one big trial. Yeah, then Omicron arrived in New Zealand, and this has led to disruptions and unplannable disruptions. So we see across all industries that there's a staff shortage in certain times. For example, people have to isolate for a while. People get sick for a week. When you have one big area that you want to manage in a big trial, if there are two staff members missing, you create a little gap in this big area. But if you create a gap, that's a risk to the whole project because everything was connected. And so we followed the advice of our technical advisory group and mitigated this risk by creating specific operational trials where we answer similar, almost the same questions with the difference that the trials are separated in space and time. That will be the way we mitigate that risk. So in a connected area, everything is connected. In a separated trials, if there's a risk to one trial, it does not affect the other trial. That's how we manage the risk, and that's why we had to adapt the pilot a little bit. And how we have done that, I will show you now. So where are the trials happening? There are three main areas. On the left side, you see Kennedy Point, on the top Ostend, and on the bottom right, you see the Rocky Bay Tifau area. And those are the three operational trial areas we work in. They're all part of the original plan. So as you can see, we separate them in space. When does it happen? The original plan was to start in May. We still do that. That's a good thing. We were able to manage the adaptation fast enough so we can still stick to the May. There are a few temporal separations in the projects, in the trials. As you can see, Kennedy Point will start in May, and the trial will run for 6 months at Kennedy Point. In Ostend, it will also start in May, but also only run for 4 months. And in Rocky Bay, we will have a 2-month trial in June and July this year. There will be more trials at the end of the year, at the beginning of next year, but these trials are not completely designed and may be affected by the results that we get from our trials this year. So we want to be flexible with this. So what does it involve, our trials? Generally, the tools, I want to introduce you to the tools that we use. That has not changed. We use traps, we use snap traps for rats in trap boxes to keep the non-target species and pets safe. So that has not changed, and we still use the same bait stations, also has not changed. What has changed is that our bait that we use, the rodent blocks, will have a certain dye in it. So whenever we find a rat and we think it has consumed bait, we can check it because the dye is visible under UV light. That's a big advantage of this new bait. The density across all trials will be very high. Every 25 meters, we will have a device. So it's a very high device density. And the servicing will be very frequent. Every week, every device will be checked. Besides the lethal tools, we also have monitoring and detection tools. That's very important, especially when rat numbers are going down and we were looking for the last ones. To find the last ones is always very difficult. And we use the tracking tunnels where rats run through the tunnel and leave footprints, and we can identify that there are footprints of rats in it. We use wax blocks in chew cards. Both are tools where rats are attracted by peanut butter and start chewing on the device, and then we can see the chew marks and say, yeah, that was a rat that has chewed it. And a very sensitive monitoring tool are trail cameras. We will use them extensively or intensively for monitoring. The advantage of trail cameras is that the rat does not have to do much. It just has to walk in front of the camera, and the camera triggers and takes a picture or a video depending on how we use it. I will come to that later in one trial, exciting one. Okay, so to give you an introduction into the 3 trials. The first one is the Kennedy Point trial. It will be conducted very similar to it was originally planned. Luckily, it's a peninsula. It has a nice bottleneck, so we were able to use the existing plan and just cut it off from the rest of the area. In the pink shaded area, as you can see, there will be traps only. So there will be no bait stations, no toxins, only traps will be used, and we will try to reduce the rat numbers on this peninsula to 0 just by using traps. This is quite difficult. It has not been tried at this scale. We have approximately 30 hectares with traps, and we want to see, is it a tool that we can actually use? And you can see north of the pink area, there's a blue line. The blue line marks an area which is our virtual barrier to protect the trapping area. And within the blue line, we will use bait stations with rodent blocks. And this is to prevent rats coming from north, from the school grounds and from areas north of the peninsula and walk into the trapping area. So that's our line of defense. And the Kennedy Point trial will answer the following questions. Can rats be removed using only traps? I mentioned there have been rat eradications in the world just using traps, but it's very rare. The failure rate is high and the areas are very small. So we are the first to test it like on a large scale with a very intense trapping program in an urbanized area. The second test that we have is just the suppression zone. This is the zone within the blue line. Actually prevent rats from walking back into the area once there are no rats. It's an attractive area for outside rats because there's food, there's no competition. They want to get there. And we want to test if the suppression zone can keep the rats out. This is important when we think about an island-wide eradication, and we cannot do the whole island at once. We will have different stages. And if we clear one area of rats, we have to defend this area against immigration. So a suppression zone using bait stations would be one tool, and we want to see if that works on Waiheke. As I mentioned, we use different detection devices, chew cards, wax blocks. We want to see what are the most sensitive in these areas. What is the best combination of detection tools? We always need a combination because a single tool is never enough for a smart rat that has already avoided traps and bait stations. So why would it go for a chew card or a wax block? Maybe it likes only one. So we will make a comparison between wax blocks and chew cards in the area. The last question focuses on one specific of Waiheke, and those are the cliffs. Cliffs are complicated to manage because they're hard to access. You cannot just walk there. You need a rope access. It's complicated. It may be very expensive. And we want to find out, can we put devices on cliffs and service them properly? Is it feasible? Is it economical? Is it possible to use it as a tool when we go island wide? Because we cannot ignore cliffs, of course, because we would create gaps and that would lead to failure. The second trial is in Ostend. It's around the transfer station and includes mangroves, industrial areas, businesses, wetlands, storages, containers. It's a rat's dream and a manager's nightmare. Everything that is complicated and complex and high risk for management is concentrated in a very small area. It's good for our trial, but yeah, again, it's a manager's nightmare. Rats have plenty of habitat to hide, to walk around. Maybe they don't need to walk far to get enough food. When you think about a rat spending a whole night around 2 or 3 cars on a scrapyard, there's so many holes and gaps that it can check. It doesn't have to walk far. So is it enough to put a bait station every 25 meters? That's a question. So the trial will happen like the following. Within the orange line and within the blue line, the whole area will be treated with bait stations and rodent blocks. And once, hopefully after 6 to 8 weeks, there will be no more rats in the area, especially in the core area. At the outside boundaries, rats will move in, but in the core area, we want to get 0 rats. So once we have achieved 0 rats, we stop baiting in the core area within the blue line. The baiting outside within the orange will be further conducted, but within the blue line, we stop baiting and start trapping. Same device density. Every 25 meters, there will be a trap. And to do that, why we do that is we want to see if the rats may avoid bait stations, go into traps, or if we trap rats, have they consumed bait? That's an important question. Every single rat that we catch has to have consumed bait. If everything's working perfectly, we will not catch a single rat. That's a good sign, but that still doesn't mean that there is no rat. So the third stage of the trial will be intense monitoring. Again, we will use chew cards and wax blocks and cameras to see if there are still rats running around that just don't eat bait and don't go into traps. And then we would have identified a problem. The questions that we answer in this trial are, do all rats in this really complex high-risk site consume lethal amounts of bait? We just have to confirm that. That's the most important. Again, the same as on Kennedy Point, we will compare detection devices. And the last part is we include mangroves into the core area. There are a lot of mangroves on Waiheke. It's a very important habitat, and it's known that rats may not live in mangroves, but they forage in mangroves. So they go and find food, and we want to know, how do we monitor them? We cannot put a trekking tunnel into the mangroves, right? It would just be washed away by the tide. And the same as a bait station. We cannot just put a bait station into the area. So which tool actually works in the mangrove area? And to do that, I want to show that device that Phil Salisbury from Korowai Waiheke has built, which is fantastic. It was already tested on a small trial. And as you can see, we have a floating bait station. It's on a raft. During low tide on the right side, you see it's sitting nice and flat and sturdy on the ground. And during high tide, it floats on the water. So we make sure that no bait gets into the water. The rats have entered these stations. We have videos of that. We have signs of rats in the stations. And there was no water in the bait station, which is also very important, that the bait station does not get flooded. So we want to test this device on a somewhat larger scale. The last area for our trials is the Rocky Bay Tifao area. This is an area, we look into the urbanized area this year, where we have one of several really, really well-managed and intense community rodent control groups. Extremely organized. It's very well managed, the community project. That means the rats in this area have a different experience with bait stations and have a different experience with bait than in other areas where no one is working or no one is baiting. So what we do there is we want to find out a little bit more about the behavior of rats around the bait stations. That's one thing I have looked into the last 7 years here in New Zealand, and you can get a lot of information out of that is valuable for control and eradication. We will have trail cameras pointing on bait stations and then observe the behavior. What does the rat do? How often do the rats come? How often do they go inside the bait station? And this will give us valuable information. The questions that we will answer with this is, does it differ between the different designs? Because, of course, the community group has a different design to what the Korowai uses. Does the design make a difference? Another thing is, the bait stations are really settled in very well in the environment. They have been there for years. They're part of the natural environment for the rats. They know them. The devices that Korowai puts in are relatively new. They still get a time to settle in, but they're relatively new compared to the Ratbuster bait stations. Thank you very much to Rocky Bay Ratbusters for cooperating with us here. This is very important. So does it change the behavior when you have these bait stations that have been used for years and the bait stations that are relatively new? The next thing is the community group puts bait out in we use a eradication setting servicing of the bait stations. That means every week we make sure that the bait stations are full of really fresh bait and new bait. There may be a difference in attractiveness of the bait, so we will also look if that influences the behavior. And then the change over time. We expect that at the beginning there will be a bit more interaction, more rats entering the bait station, but what happens over time? In a perfect world, you don't see rats anymore coming to the bait station, then you know it has worked quite well. In a not so perfect world, you see the rats still coming, but not going into the bait stations anymore. And that would be a cause that, or a reason that could cause the failure of eradication, not getting the last ones. And so that's a very behavioral research in Rocky Bay.